Welcome to the Bagel Logic Podcast, the show where Papa Tom spreads wisdom like a smear of cream cheese on an everything bagel. Here's your host, Thom Jennings.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Bagel Logic. I'm not sure if this will be the last episode ever. It may not be. Just some updates on a personal level. I've got a couple of projects that I'm pretty excited about that involve music and podcasting that showing some promise, something that I should be able to monetize and maybe earn a little bit of extra income, which is good because those of us that are still paying student loans because they went back to school as an adult, it'll help. Any little bit will help. And as much as I certainly love doing podcasting, it's, you know, it's tough. It's tough when you have anything that you do that's considered a hobby and doesn't generate an income when you need the money. You know, I mean, if you're independently wealthy, you can always have these vanity projects and there's no stress on it because it's like, well, I just enjoy it. And to a large degree, of course, this is a vanity project, but you know, part of the thought process behind it was to ultimately be able to come up with some podcasts that I could monetize. And as much as there is a degree of satisfaction in being a teacher, I've only taught special education for the last decade and a half, and it drains you. It's been I certainly don't get the satisfaction out of it that I once did. I don't necessarily see an end game for that, but if there was something that maybe on my final chapters of life, you know, not to be morbid, but you know, I'm at least in the final third, if not the final eighth, that it'd be nice to do something that was a little bit more enjoyable and you know, whatever. In fact, the other day, it's funny. So I'm 57 now, and I went and applied for a position as a bartender, and I don't know, just the look of the guy, because I applied in person, which was weird. It was a paper application, and the guy looks at me, and you know, one of the questions on the job application was the year you graduated from high school, which to me is kind of an unfair question because ultimately it's a fishing expedition to kind of see how old you are. Most people, you can get it within a couple of years if you know what year that they graduated high school. So, he asked me a couple of cursory questions, and I actually had a fairly close friend who was friends with somebody that owned the bar, and it didn't really, it didn't help, you know. It never ceases to amaze me, and this will probably go nicely into the topic today, that how much everything in life depends on who you know, not what you know. There's all these connections, and really at the core, you know, people always say things like, oh, you know, racism doesn't exist and all these things have changed. And I mean, that is, if you really want to understand racism and the plight of African Americans and other minority groups, it really comes down to these are groups that just didn't have access to either families or friends that were able to get them into jobs where they could come out of poverty. I mean, that's just the reality of it. And the ones, you know, some people are lucky. They have a talent, whether it be in, you know, broadcasting or music or athletics or business, you know, any of those types of things. And you can come out of poverty. And that's not race specific. And it happens to all of us. But it really, it's kind of crazy how generations really are they're kind of tight knit. And they wield some power. And I don't have that. And at times it's very frustrating. You know, in terms of do I ever use any kind of influence I have? Well, sure. You know, I get free concert tickets all the time because I've written for the newspaper. But even then, you know, I write for a smaller publication, so I don't have the type of access that, say, the guy that worked for the larger newspaper had. But anyhow, with those two projects coming up, professional, with the goal towards monetizing them, earning at least a second income, probably neither one of them enough to earn a be the primary source of income. I'll still do these Bagel Logic podcasts, and I'm hoping maybe the episode today, something comes out of it. Not real hopeful. This is a podcast I haven't maintained as much as I should. I think there was a little bit of momentum at the front end, so I don't know if there's any real listenership or not. But if there was ever an episode that I hope gets shared or I hope finds somebody, this is the one. Because it's just kind of a weird situation that I don't even know how I ran across it. It was a Facebook. There was a Facebook group called Justice for Theresa Karlak. I believe that's how you pronounce her last name. It's Karlak. And I started going through this thing. Now, I mentioned I write for a newspaper. When I first started writing for a newspaper, it was a newspaper called the Medina Journal-Register. And on occasion, I would write some political exposés, things like that. And it caused a lot of trouble. And early on in my career with the Medina Journal-Register, I was caught in this weird conundrum where I was getting pressure from certain forces to, be this gadfly and stir up all these problems. And that never really left. I mean, there were still people that had it out for me, and probably still are, in Orleans County. And at one point, somebody reached out to me. The guy's name, he had a screen name Mad Mark. I mean, I later learned that his name was Mark Taylor. And the Medina Journal-Register used to have this thing called the Forum, and they would post, people would post things on there, and it was kind of maybe an early version of Twitter for Orleans County. I don't know, but Mad Mark was one of the frequent posters. There's another guy named Paul Lauricella. He's still active in Orleans County politics. I don't know whatever happened to Mark Taylor, but Mark was one day reached out to me and he said, "Oh, I have all this information about a story about a murder that happened in Orleans County that was covered up." And this is the first time I'll actually say what the murder was that he claimed had happened. I've never investigated it, so when I say this is all secondhand information. I don't want anyone to think that I'm saying this person was murdered. I'm saying that Mark reached out to me and said, "Oh, this person was murdered." So I called my editor of the newspaper, and granted, this is still just a part-time vocation for me, and 20 years later, it still is. And he says, "Oh, I got all this evidence and everything." And I call my editor, and I said, "Listen, this whole thing kind of freaks me out. I'm not I'm not an investigative reporter. I'm just a guy with whatever. I'm just writing a weekly column." It was kind of an op-ed column, and it was really meant to stimulate conversation. It wasn't meant to aggravate people. And maybe in looking back at some of the articles I wrote, I could see where you would touch some nerves, but that was kind of the goal of it. It was more intended to touch nerves in kind of a funny way, make people think about things or question things, things like that. But we've progressed as a society where it's difficult to question things anymore without somebody getting upset, regardless of your political affiliation. So my editor, I said, "Do you think I should record this conversation?" At the time, I was doing a project for SUNY Brockport and was doing all these archival interviews about a project. If you're not familiar, 1969 Kent State, there was a shooting and a bunch of college campuses were taken over by students. And SUNY Brockport was one of those. So I interviewed a bunch of the people that participated in those Kent State protests, and they actually occupied the office building and things like that. And on a side note, it's kind of sad that we don't see that kind of passion really anymore on college campuses. The January 6th thing, when you really get down to it, was pretty horrific in that it was an attempt to take over the government. But, these people at least were willing to protest for something that they believed in. Same with Black Lives Matter. I mean, I admire people that will protest for things that they believe in. Not necessarily admiring people for protesting things that I don't believe in, but I admire the act of protest, because I think that if we're ever going to have any change in this country, You really do have to organize. You have to protest. You have to make your point. But that, again, that's a double-edged sword. So, we had protests against racism. We had protests against segregation in the South, and a lot of people were killed in the process. So, and you had counter-protests, people that were fighting against segregation. Do I support those people? No, but, again, there's passion there and things like that. But anyhow, the Kent State protests, for the most part, were fairly benign. There wasn't a ton of violence involved in them. There were violent incidents, but there wasn't a ton of violence. There were fairly peaceful protests in kind of the tradition of the Martin Luther King Jr. and Gandhi method of protest. And unfortunately, they were a reaction to a very violent incident and a violent reaction towards a college protest. And then there was a subsequent protest as well in a predominantly African American college. Whatever. I'm off on the beaten trail. But I was recording these archival interviews for SUNY Brockport, and it's already had the recording equipment to record phone calls. So it really wasn't like I had to say, well, if I'm going to talk to this guy, I got to get all this special equipment or anything like that. I already had it. A previous episode you've heard, I record phone calls all the time. For whatever. I record personal conversations if there is something that I feel is going to be dealing with a legal situation, especially if you're going to do a podcast like this and name a name like Mark Taylor or whatever. You're going to have to cover yourself if there's any kind of lawsuit. But Mark can sue me. There's nothing to sue me for except debt and house in my wife's name. So they're not getting that either. Just don't take the record collection. So anyhow, this guy Mark Taylor, he says he's like, oh yeah, this guy Milford Finney is a former DA in Orleans County, that he said that the guy was murdered. He said, I had bags full of evidence and and everything. And again, this is all to my best recollections, but there's a recording of it. So I mean, it's not some fantastic story that I'm making up, that if somebody says I made it up. In fact, Mark, at one point, he and I became enemies because I refused to write the story. Because I said, if I don't have the evidence, I'm not going to write about a guy being murdered. Because, I have to respect if he has any family members around that would be distressed by this. And the true story, or the story that was reported, this guy was a farmer and he died in a farming accident. So if you can't show me anything that proves that something else happened, I'm not going to write about it. And Mark, Mark would come across things on occasion that were legit, like a lot of corruption. And in Orleans County, it, to come full circle back to the beginning of the podcast, it really does. It is a county where it's not what you know, it's who you know. It really is. I mean, there's a, I hate to use the term old boys network because it sounds so gender specific, but to a certain degree, there's not a better way to name it, but we'll call it that, the Old Boys Network. So where does this come into play for this Theresa Karlak? Well, Theresa Karlak, 18 years old, it's January 2022, New Year's Day. These are the facts. She's walking down the road with her sister. Her sister is 13 years old. And they're walking down a road called Eagle Harbor Road, which is in Orleans County. I mean, you look it up on Google Maps if you want. I'm familiar with the road. We actually had my doctor lived there, and we used to deliver bagels to him all the time. So I'm fairly familiar with where the accident happened. No sidewalks. Definitely not the best of roads to be walking down at night. But she's walking down the road at night, and she gets hit, struck, and killed. So, yeah. Car operated by a guy named, looks like Zachary Harding, right? 24-year-old Zachary Harding. But, yeah, it's, so the mother, she creates this Facebook page about all this stuff that's going on. And from what the mother has reported on the Justice for Theresa Karlak page, she presents a case that's very compelling in terms of how the district attorney has been handling the case, how the even the Department of Motor Vehicles is handling the case. And I don't know. I'll probably play a bit of an excerpt of it just so you can, get just a flavor of it and everything. And I will say, I don't know both sides of the story. I've started to kind of do this cursory look into it, but I'm not really an investigative reporter. I'm still dealing with a degree of guilt that I did begin the pursuit of this case involving Greg Fickus, who was a person whose brother I worked with that was murdered, and that case went unsolved, and it just had its 30th anniversary. So that this case kind of triggered a lot of those emotions where I looked at it and go, man. But, it also triggered a lot of emotions of just some of the nonsense that I dealt with when I was in Orleans County. And at least when the Medina Journal-Register, which was a small newspaper that served Orleans County, at least when that existed, there was some, we'll call it journalistic integrity. Now, on a national level, people are constantly beating up on journalists right now, and it's fake news, fake news, fake news. And really, it's a tactic. It's a tactic by politicians, Democrats and Republicans, to discredit the organization that is the watchdog, or supposed to be. That's the role of the media. The media's role has always been to be the watchdog of politicians. Now, even though we live in an age where information is readily accessible to most people that want to seek and find it, there has been this steady drumbeat to discredit journalists. And I think it goes back as far as Watergate. Watergate happens. The media, they say, well, the media took down the President of the United States. I mean, the reality is the President of the United States took himself down. Richard Nixon was involved in criminal activities. He recorded his discussions about the criminal activities. I mean, there's no question about it. The evidence was all there. And it got to the point where he had to resign. And even those in his own party weren't willing to support him because the media had enough influence and credibility that they could take the case and present it to the American public. The American public could look at it for what it was, and then he was out. Now, fast forward, you get to presidents like Ronald Reagan, who gets involved in arms for hostages. He's able to survive it. And then we've slowly progressed to the point where there's just all kinds of stuff going on, and nobody really knows what it is. And it's very rare that the media is in a position to expose anything. Now, on a local level, these little micro newspapers, I mean, they were the ones that could expose any potential stuff that was going on. So, for example, Orleans County. Now, when I had run for office in Orleans County in 2008 through 2012-ish or so. And there's one in the archives where I talk about this too. And the guy that was the head of the Orleans County legislature was a guy named David Callard. He'd run for Congress. I mean, this guy was the thing. And Callard winds up resigning office just abruptly. Now, the story that I heard secondhand, I guess the factual piece is that there was somebody that went in and vandalized his house while he was on vacation. The kind of underground narrative is that there was some illicit sexual relationship going on between Mr. Callard and somebody else. Whether it was this guy's son or whether it was the kid himself that damaged the house, I don't know. I've heard 2, 3, 4 different stories. And I don't spread this rumor to be salacious. I'm just saying that the rumor exists. Now, here's the issue. You don't have a newspaper like the Medina Journal-Register that would have had the gumption to try to investigate the story and get the true story. That's why we don't know the true story, because no one from the media has investigated it. because if you investigated a story involving the head of the Orleans County Legislature, they will make life a living hell for you. They will. Dave Kallert I didn't even run against him. I ran against his party when I worked for the Orleans County YMCA. Himself and the county executive at the time both contacted a member of the board to have me terminated because they still had that old grudge from years ago. And how much do newspapers hit the nerve of places? Well, in Albion, for example, when I had written a piece about the Albion schools, the superintendent of the Albion schools called the newspaper editor and said that they were canceling their newspaper subscription for newspapers in the classroom because she was upset that we had said something that upset her, and then said that the newspaper couldn't report scores, like sports scores, in the newspaper. Okay? That's how, and obviously you can't prevent a newspaper from reporting sports scores. It's public information. But this is the thing you contend with in a small town. So at the time, the editor of the Medina Journal-Register, he was a guy from out of state, or out of the area. Maybe, I think he was from New York State. And he's an editor for the New York Times now. Brilliant writer. But, I mean, this guy had no fear. And there was even a case where there was a situation with an Albion police officer who, ran his car into a wall. There were suggestions that he may have been intoxicated. There was a whole series of pieces written about that. There was a mayor in Albion, got caught up in a bunch of scandals. The newspaper wrote about that. So now the only source of news that really exists in Orleans County as I don't know what you call it, the keeper of the flame, the lighthouse, is something called the Orleans Hub. Now, I know the guy that does the most of the writing for the Orleans Hub. His name's Thom. I won't say his last name. You can look it up easily enough. I like Thom. But Thom is in a no-win situation. He cannot take on the politicians. On occasion, he does. He will write about situations which he feels somewhat passionate about. But I'm sure he gets a bit of flack for it. But there's a line he doesn't cross. Like this case here, this Theresa Karlak case. I believe that's a line he hasn't crossed yet. But I think it's a story that sadly is worth further investigation. And if a newspaper like the Medina Journal-Register existed, the Theresa Karlak case would have been investigated. There would have been some bears poked. They would have looked to see if this was good old boys network at work. And maybe to some degree, we would have a mother whose child was hit by a car in the middle of the night. She'd at least get some answers. Now, if you take this driver and you just chuck him into jail and ruin his life or whatever, that doesn't necessarily solve anything, okay? But if you have somebody that gets involved in an accident where there's some suspicious circumstances, and from what I've seen, there's evidence that exists, and I'll say that again, from what I've seen, based on things that the mother's posted on Facebook and everything, that there is evidence that there was, or there's at least, I would say, a reasonable amount of suspicion in terms of whether there was drug or alcohol use involved in this particular accident. If nothing else, there's got to be a degree of negligence. I mean, you can't necessarily write off hitting a kid, an 18-year-old young lady, like you would a deer. You know what I mean? So, but again, if that is the case, if it's a case where the mother is overreacting, she still deserves to be heard. And, going back to the Dave Kallert situation, I mean, situations that I've dealt with in Orleans County, I don't necessarily find it impossible to believe. But there's a fine line. Because, the Mark Taylor story about the district attorney being murdered, I never found any credible evidence to that. I think it was, it was one of those things that maybe they say if you really want to get a good story, you come up with something that's so unbelievable, people will believe it. I don't necessarily fall in that category. I'm a naturally suspicious individual. I've had plenty of situations in my life where I have been 100% wrong, absolutely incorrect. So, I may just be another person looking at this particular situation through my lens with my operational bias saying, oh, well, Theresa Karlak is involved in a situation where there's not really a cover-up. This is just a terrible accident, and the mother is overreacting. But man, I mean, it just blows my mind how little attention this thing has received. Now, one of the posts that she put on Facebook, just as an example, talked about how the district, first of all, there was a DMV hearing, and this is secondhand information from the mother. There was a hearing at the DMV, and a bunch of evidence was not presented there, and they decided not to take this young person who hit the girl and killed her with his car, decided not to take that person's license away. And because of the DMV hearing, somehow the district attorney decided that they didn't have enough evidence to pursue the case. And then there's other reports that the district attorney had filed the paperwork for the case in the wrong jurisdiction. So again, these accusations are out there. This information is out there. And unfortunately, now the silence of a publication like the Orleans Hub makes me that much more suspicious. It really does. Because to some degree, if you really want to quell the story, the best thing would be to present all the facts in such a way that it would be for the common person to go, oh yeah, this was just a terrible accident. It's just a horrible situation. But since it was just nothing, and this was the same situation with Callard. So when Dave Callard resigns from the Orleans County Legislature, it's like, quiet. Everything's real quiet. And there was some like, I think there was a court case involving the vandalism to the house, and that was reported in a very matter-of-fact way. But none of the other stuff was. And again, I just, to me, that just made things look that much more suspicious. And I know how the machine works in Orleans County, and I tell you, the fact that I live in Genesee County, in some ways, which is a county south of Orleans, for those of you who don't live in the region that may be listening to this, is refreshing. Because I just don't have to deal with that bullshit anymore. And it was so stressful and cost my family and everything all kinds of financial and emotional hardship for many years. And, I have these two sons that grew up in the area that they don't even visit really anymore because of everything that happened. I mean, it's like they drove them out. But, and that's not to say that Orleans County doesn't have redeeming qualities. Of course it does. At the end of the day, a community is really made up of its citizens and its people. And they're the ones who should be in control of the situation. But in Orleans County, on a political level, these people run unopposed all the time. They have absolute power. They have absolute control. And I don't know if the citizens seem helpless or feel helpless, but my suspicion is that there is a high enough percentage of those that are benefiting from this arrangement that you won't see any real change. I mean, think about segregation. If we go back to those days, or even back further, slavery, until you get 51% of the population that wants to get rid of it, it ain't going anywhere. Now, at some point, there had to be a degree of people that were benefiting from and supporting segregationist policies. I mean, segregation's an easy one. Even in Rochester, New York, where I grew up in the 1960s, I didn't grow up in the 60s. I was born in 66. But there were protests because the major employer, Kodak, really didn't hire African-American workers. So if I'm a white guy and I'm applying for a job at Kodak in the 1960s, my dad gets me in, the think about this college admissions scandal and all that now with the nepotism and whatnot. I don't want the system to change. What, do I have to be the guy that gives up my job, the white guy that gives up my job because you guys didn't hire enough black people? Yeah, that's the mentality. Like, do I get it? Yeah, I kind of get it. I trust me. I didn't complain about age discrimination when I was 20 years old, but now that I'm 57, I deal with it all the time. I just dealt with it when I was trying to get a job as a bartender. And the only reason I got my last job as a bartender was because of who I knew at the time. It really didn't even necessarily have to do with, yeah, sure, I had the skills and all that others, but it just happened. I just happened to know the guy that owned the bar. And he needed somebody. So it was convenient. It wasn't, I didn't come in off the street and apply for a job because I probably wouldn't have gotten it. But, yeah, so this Theresa Karlak case, I'm not going to play any of the stuff on Facebook. It's out there. I would encourage you, if you've listened to this podcast, to go and look for the Facebook page, to join it, go through the evidence, and I don't know. I like recently they just had this thing, this podcast about the Murdochs. This really wealthy family in, I believe, South Carolina, where, the guy had been involved in a lot of suspicious stuff before he was finally convicted of murdering his wife and his son. But there was a case there where the kid, if you're not familiar with it, there was a kid, he was on a boat, clearly intoxicated, and got into an accident and killed somebody. And he didn't do any time in jail. And it's just crazy. And you look back on that and you go, wow, that's just horrible. That stuff goes on all the time. And the only way you're ever going to stop it, the only way people are going to get justice is if somebody brings a light to it. And I don't know what it's going to take for this mother, but I tell you, if you live in Orleans County and you know anybody or anything, you should be talking about this case. You should be talking about it with anybody and everybody that will listen, because even though Theresa Karlak's not my kid, and they're probably not your kid unless her mother's listening to me, and if the mother does listen, my God, I feel horrible for what you're going through. I can't even imagine the pain. I can't even imagine having to deal with this old boys network, this hush thing, and having lost a child in the process. And it seems like none of these guys have any shame. That's horrible. You deserve better. I don't know what the county government's role in this situation should be, to offer whatever support they can give this mother. Anything that they can. And if there's a civil suit involved, I would imagine that there would be. Potentially there's going to be money involved. The facts are the facts. Kid driving a car, hit somebody, kills him. Whatever. It happens. You killed somebody. There's liability involved. At least I hope. But anyhow, yeah, as I said, I don't know, man. These situations frustrate me. And it's a shame that it has to get to, to me, this is a case that should be on like Dateline NBC, or maybe somebody who does a professional podcast or something like that. And, I wish I had the resources to really do it. If we were going to do an investigative podcast on this thing, I wish I had the resources to do it right. But, the problem there too would be, if I start poking the bear, I don't know what's going to happen to this poor woman's family. I really don't. And I almost find it hard to believe that there'd be anyone in Orleans County that would even be willing to cooperate with me if I was to try to do interviews or anything like that. And I would need somebody that's in Orleans County to make it happen. So, I don't know. And again, I just went through this with Greg Fickus, where the police basically said, oh, you bring light to this. You get all these Looney Tunes that come out of the woodwork with all these crazy stories. And, we just don't need that for the parents. It'll put too much stress on the parents and everything like that. I don't know, man. Like, if any of you have ever had a kid that was ever 18 years old, imagine. Had a sibling and was at age 18. And just imagine them being gone in a situation like this. And then not getting any kind of satisfaction. Whew. Yeah. No. So, I don't know. There's the old expression, oh, I'm not going to lose sleep. I've lost sleep over this one. This is a difficult case. I feel helpless, and I don't know if I ever met this girl or not. They said she worked at Tim Hortons. She may have waited on me at Tim Hortons. I don't know her personally. Do I know her mom? No. But let me tell you, when I listened to her voice on the videos that she posted on that Facebook page, I feel her pain. I feel it. This isn't a woman who is just some kind of hysterical Looney Tunes. This is a woman who's in deep emotional distress, and nobody seems to be willing to help her get through it. And that's not a great place to be. Not at all. I've been there too. Where I've been at a low point and it just feels like the entire world has left you. Even though in situations, sometimes they haven't. Sometimes you have this support system, but it's really hard to reach out to it. But there is that moment where where you're on that island and you just feel nothing. So I don't know. That's my rant for today. A little jumbled. A little raw, I suppose. But hey, that's what it's about. And again, I don't know when I'll record another one of these episodes. I've had the best of intentions. We've had a lot going on in terms of family, and mostly good. So, it's not one of those like, oh, I haven't been able to record because, blah, blah, blah. I deal with my occasional bouts of depression, and, right now I'm at a fairly level point, which is good. But man, I said situations like this, just, I don't know. And I've struggled with whether I was ever going to record a podcast about this, because the double-edged sword is this. If nobody listens to it, then it's basically just been a venting session for me, and nothing's come out of it. And that's almost more frustrating than if I hadn't done it at all. But there's a part of me that has a weird feeling that this is going to find somebody. It's going to find somebody who does care. And I mean, imagine if that's you and you're able to solve this case. Because you got two families involved here. It's not just all about the victim. It's about the person that was driving the car, their family too. Like, if my kid's the guy that's driving the car that hits somebody and they die, like, that's going to impact me too. And don't think that is lost on me. It's not. I'm not here to try to ruin a young man's life if this just turned out to be an accident. Not by any stretch of the imagination. I don't need to bear that cross. Okay? But if the guy's innocent, then those facts need to come out too. Because that's going to give some peace to his family, right? He didn't do it. It was an accident. All this other stuff that's out there is bullshit. Clear your name, man. Clear your name. That's going to be better for their family too. So, all right. Nothing to do with bagels today, but hopefully some logic thrown in there, a little history, all that kind of good stuff. And yeah, do me a favor, man. Share this episode. Get on that webpage. Do anything. I don't know. Maybe I said, if this case, not this podcast, if this case finds the right person, then and there's some resolution that comes out of it. I mean, you've done good. You've done good. All right. So there we go. Once again, thanks for listening. Bagel Logic Podcast.